Let's start with the mildly inconvenient and slowly work our way towards the single most consequential nap in military history. Because while most people change the course of World War II through bravery, sacrifice, or careful planning, Adolf Hitler managed to do it repeatedly by maintaining the sleep schedule of a teenager who had just discovered late night films. He was up until 3 or 4 in the morning most nights, wouldn't surface until midday, and had built an entire military command structure around this fact, one that would cost Germany dearly every time it could least afford the delay. Number 5, Rommel's supply crisis in North Africa. By 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had earned the nickname the Desert Fox, which is one of those military titles that actually sounds impressive, as opposed to, say, Big Nose George. He was tearing across North Africa with enough speed and skill to genuinely alarm the Allied command, and the British forces opposing him were struggling to keep pace. The problem was that Rommel's army was running on fumes, literally. They were critically short on fuel, ammunition, and armor, and Rommel knew that without a serious resupply effort, the campaign was going to expire quietly in the sand. So he asked, loudly and repeatedly. His requests traveled up through the German command structure and eventually arrived where all meaningful decisions in the Third Reich had to arrive, at Adolf Hitler. Which would have been a workable system if Hitler operated on anything resembling a normal schedule. He did not. This was not a closely guarded secret. It was treated as a fixed atmospheric condition of the regime, something you built your plans around and complained about only when absolutely no one important was listening. Hitler was routinely awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, holding court with whichever members of his inner circle hadn't yet found a credible excuse to leave the room. He wouldn't surface until around 11 at the earliest. His chief valet had standing instructions to let him sleep undisturbed, and those around him took that broadly enough to mean nobody was going to knock on that door. Not for a field commander's resupply request, not for anything short of a British paratrooper landing directly on the balcony. Rommel's requests sat in a queue. Aides shuffled them between desks, looked at each other, looked at the clock, checked whether the Fuhrer was awake yet. He wasn't, and quietly put the paperwork back down. Critical supply windows closed. Tanks sat idle in the desert for lack of fuel, while the approval chain terminated at a door nobody would touch. Rommel would eventually be stopped at El Alamein in late 1942, the battle most historians consider the turning point of the entire North African campaign. Whether timelier resupply could have changed that outcome is genuinely debated. What no one debates is that the man who needed fuel was waiting on a man who was waiting on his valet to confirm it was, in fact, afternoon. For Rommel, the campaign ended in Egypt. For Germany, North Africa was gone, along with the Mediterranean access and the oil fields beyond it that the whole operation had been designed to reach. Number 4, Operation Barbarossa and the problem with being the only adult in the room. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, it was the largest military operation in the history of organized warfare. 3 million soldiers, a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The kind of campaign that demands fast, responsive decisions at the top of the chain. A commander who is alert, available, and capable of acting on new information before the opportunity disappears. What it got instead was Adolf Hitler. He had been overriding his generals from the start, centralizing command to the point where virtually every significant decision on the Eastern Front had to route back through him personally. His daily briefings didn't start until afternoon. Frontline commanders who needed urgent authorization to exploit a breakthrough or respond to a Soviet counteroffensive were sending requests up the chain that sat for hours unactioned while headquarters waited for the Fuhrer to surface. Army groups stalled. Supplies hadn't run out. The roads were passable. The problem specifically was that the final word had to come from one man. That man was asleep, and the culture around him had made clear that nobody was going to be the one to change that. Picture a German general on the Eastern Front watching a tactical window open up in front of him. Maybe 6 hours before Soviet forces regroup and close it, he sends his request at 6 in the morning. Someone at Wolf's Lair takes it, looks at the time, looks down the hall, and sets it carefully aside. You hear back sometime after lunch. The window is gone. You add it to an increasingly long mental list of windows that have gone and quietly accept that this is what it means to fight a war from someone else's afternoon. The campaign that was supposed to finish before the Russian winter arrived did not finish. Not that winter, not the next. The Soviet Union absorbed the invasion, regrouped, and eventually began pushing back with an army that had learned from being hit. The Eastern Front, which Hitler had insisted on micromanaging from a midday schedule he refused to reconsider, became Germany's most catastrophic commitment of the entire war, and that is a genuinely competitive category. Number 3, the Battle of the Bulge and Germany's last gamble. By the winter of 1944, Germany was losing badly on every front. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. The sensible response would have been to find a way out while options still existed. Hitler's response was to plan the largest German offensive operation since the invasion of France, a massive armored push through the Ardennes forest designed to split the Allied line, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It was a bold plan. It also required meticulous coordination, which meant it was going to have a scheduling problem. Bold plans in 1944 still needed execution that moved faster than Germany's command structure was built to support. Every layer of the planning process eventually bottlenecked at the same place it always had. Hitler's formal briefings by late 1944 rarely started before mid-afternoon. His personal physician, the tireless Dr. Theodor Morell, had by this point administered somewhere in the neighborhood of 82 different substances to his patient in an effort to keep him operational. All of them by injection, which probably explains why the afternoon briefings ran as long as they did. The result was a man awake at unpredictable hours, difficult to engage coherently during the day, and occasionally very confident about situations that did not warrant confidence. Officers with urgent questions about troop movements and fuel allocations submitted their requests in the morning and waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for most of the day. During the planning phase itself, the bottleneck was a daily constant. Division commanders needed logistical answers that determined whether their forces would be in position when the offensive launched. Those answers lived behind a door that didn't open until afternoon at the earliest, and that delay compounded across weeks of preparation. When the offensive launched in December 1944, it achieved genuine tactical surprise, but Germany's ability to press advantages and adapt to Allied resistance was hamstrung throughout by a command structure dependent on one man's afternoon availability. The advance stalled at Bastogne, the weather broke, and Allied air power came back in force, and Germany's last major offensive slowly exhausted itself in the Belgian snow. Germany never launched another significant offensive after December 1944. Number 2, surviving the bomb and becoming even more convinced. On July 20th, 1944, a briefcase bomb exploded inside a conference room at Wolf's Lair while Hitler was standing a few feet away. A group of German military officers had arranged this specifically. 4 people died. Hitler walked away with ruptured eardrums and minor burns and an absolute conviction that he was under divine protection, that his survival was proof fate had made plans for him and wasn't interested in revising them. This was, by any measure, the most unfortunate conclusion a person could reach after being nearly killed by his own officers in 1944, with the Soviet army approaching from the east and 2 Allied armies advancing from the west. And yet, surviving an assassination attempt when you already believe you're essentially unkillable doesn't teach you anything. It confirms what you already thought. Hitler wasn't shaken by July 20th. He was validated. The purge that followed was not the response of a frightened man, it was a man who believed he couldn't die settling accounts with the people who had tried to prove otherwise. Hundreds were arrested and executed, including some of Germany's most capable remaining military officers, exactly the people Germany could least afford to lose as the war entered its final desperate phase. Experienced commanders who understood the actual state of things and might have communicated it effectively were gone. Rommel was implicated and forced to take his own life that October. The officer class, already stretched thin, was gutted further, and the sleep specifically deteriorated sharply in the aftermath. Before July 20th, Hitler's schedule had been erratic but broadly predictable. Late nights, midday wake-ups, afternoon briefings. After the bomb, it became genuinely chaotic. He was sleeping at strange hours, sometimes conducting briefings past midnight and being unreachable until the following evening. Morell's remedies became more aggressive, which made the underlying problem worse. Nobody around Hitler had any reliable sense of when he would be available, which meant the decision bottleneck that had always existed got significantly longer. His effective decision-making window shrank to a few hours a day, and the decisions produced during those hours grew steadily more detached from the military situation on the ground. Number 1. D-Day. June 6th, 1944. The largest amphibious assault in history. Allied forces landing on 5 beaches across 50 miles of Normandy coastline, backed by 10,000 aircraft and the biggest naval fleet ever assembled. If the Allies secured a foothold and began moving men and supplies inland, the war was over in months. The window in which Germany could stop it was narrow, and that window opened and closed in the early hours of June 6th while a man in Bavaria was asleep. The night before, Hitler had been up until 3 in the morning at the Berghof watching newsreels with Goebbels and Eva Braun. Standard. A violent storm had been battering the French coastline for days, convincing German high command that no Allied landing was imminent. Rommel had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. Other senior commanders had scattered across the country for personal reasons. The weather had made everyone comfortable. That was a mistake. At 4 in the morning, calls started arriving at Wolf's Lair. Paratroopers over Normandy, tens of thousands of them. Hitler's aides found him asleep. They did not wake him. What followed was one of the most consequential failures to knock on a door in recorded history. 2 reserve panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, were positioned close enough to the beaches to mount a real armored counterattack. General von Rundstedt ordered them to move at 7:30 in the morning. He was informed that those divisions could not commit without Hitler's personal authorization. Hitler was asleep. The tanks waited. Those morning hours were, by every serious historical assessment, Germany's best and likely only window to destroy the landings before they became permanent. Cloud cover was heavy, Allied air power was largely grounded, and the beachheads were at their most thin and vulnerable. Every hour that passed without German armor reaching those beaches was an hour the Allies used to bring more men ashore, push inland, and build something that couldn't be reversed. Hitler woke around noon, reportedly cheerful, convinced that Normandy was a feint, and the real invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais. He thought this was good news. Authorization for the panzers came at 4 in the afternoon. By 4 in the afternoon, the clouds had cleared. Allied fighter bombers were over Normandy in force. The panzer division spent the rest of the day crawling from one tree line to the next, sheltering under cover, waiting for darkness to advance. They never reached the beaches in time to matter. Within weeks, the breakout began. Within months, Paris was free. By the end of 1944, Allied forces were approaching the German border. The war was no longer a question of whether, only when. On the night of June 5th, a small group of people at the Berghof knew the invasion had arrived. They stood in a hallway. They looked at each other, looked at the clock, looked at the door. Nobody knocked. Whether it was fear of the man inside, genuine uncertainty about whether Normandy was the real thing, or simply nobody wanting to be the person responsible for that call. That moment of collective hesitation in a corridor may have done more to determine the outcome of World War II than almost any single act of planning or courage on either side. The most powerful military force in continental Europe stopped by a nap.